And please welcome USGLC board member Evelyn Farkas.
Hello, everyone. That's really peppy music they have for us here. Hopefully you're all awake. I'm Evelyn Farkas. I'm the Executive Director of the McCain Institute. I am also a proud member of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition board. And I'm happy, really, and honored to be able to introduce and to interview our next speaker. We heard, of course, from Beijing earlier today. We heard from Ambassador Burns. We heard about America's China strategy, what we need to do in terms of diplomacy and development. And today, right now, Congressman Mike Gallagher is going to join us to talk about the comprehensive strategy vis-a-vis China from the perspective of Congress. Congressman Gallagher, he serves as the inaugural chair of the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, the so-called China Committee. He has served in Congress since 2019, representing his district in Wisconsin. USGLC was fortunate actually to host Chairman Gallagher in his home district in 2018 on the importance of America's global leadership. And so we're obviously very glad to be able to reunite with him today. Just a few other comments about his background. He is, as you know, probably passionate about the issues pertaining to China and to our national security. He is a Marine Corps veteran. He served for 7 years on active duty, including 2 tours in Iraq. And he was also the lead Republican staffer for the Middle East and Counterterrorism Committee on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So he comes with a lot of experience, a lot of passion, and we look forward to hearing from him today. Welcome, Congressman Gallagher. In January, you were appointed as the first chair of this select committee. You really have been in the spotlight since then. You are the lead voice, Republican, but also, frankly, for the bipartisan committee because you are working so closely with your counterpart. And so we really want to hear from you with regard to what your vision is for America. How should we be competing with China? And what should the comprehensive approach be? So obviously, one component of it is deterrence, which you know very well. How does democracy and development fit into it? So Congressman, if you could just take that first question, that would be great. Okay, I think we need to pause you for 1 second. It's coming through garbled. But I know you wanted to thank USGLC, thank Liz Schreier.
Is that any better?
Let's see, does that work?
Any better right there?
Yes, perfect. Okay, over to you, Congressman.
Insert joke about the Chinese hacking my system here.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I've really been proud to have such a long relationship with USGLC that goes back to when I was a staffer working for Les Munson on the Senate side of Capitol Hill, back when I had real power. And just quickly, I mean, maybe say a couple practical words about what the speaker asked me to do with this committee. One was to make it a bipartisan effort. He wants Congress, to the extent possible, to speak with a unified voice on this issue. We don't have to grant everything, but wants us to identify the center of gravity and also explain to our colleagues and by extension the American people why any of this matters. I sort of think about it in the same way I think about the conversation we had in my district with USGLC about why American leadership matters. We can't just take for granted that our fellow Americans get the stakes here, particularly when the threat, I think, is a bit more pernicious and insidious than, let's say, the Soviet threat in the early parts of the old Cold War. We've had a variety of Sputnik moments, but we've not seemed to wake up. So our sort of core tasks are twofold. One is to constantly explain why people should care about this competition with the Chinese Communist Party and why we should desire to win this competition. And two, act as the speaker's kind of accelerator and incubator on key, smart, strong China-related legislation in Congress, which is important to have a committee doing that because China transcends every committee jurisdiction. So I have the fun task of kind of coordinating among all the different committee chairs and making sure everyone feels the love and trying to make sure that we actually get stuff done in divided government. So with that practical foundation, how do I view the sort of overall grand strategy? Well, I've always thought of it as having three buckets or three lines of effort. The first, as you alluded to, is the sort of military competition, hard power, the most acute expression of which is how do we deter a conflict over Taiwan within the next 5 years? The second line of effort is what I would call economic statecraft. How do we figure out this complex question of de-risking or selective economic decoupling? What are the right mix of sticks and carrots that we need to reclaim our economic independence in some areas? I was listening to the end of the last panel, ensuring U.S. dollar supremacy lasts and expanding it is obviously part of that equation. And then the third line of effort is what I call ideological competition. How do we make our domestic institutions as well as of our multilateral institutions more resilient against the efforts by the Chinese Communist Party via united front work to weaken them and to diminish us in the ideological domain? And so the Select Committee is marching out on those three lines of effort. We have policy recommendations that are due by the end of this year. We just released our first two reports. The first was focused on defense, on near-term deterrence for Taiwan. We started with that because there's a National Defense Authorization Act markup coming up, and we wanted to take our recommendations and then put them actually into the NDAA. And then we had a second report based on a hearing we held on the ongoing genocide in the Xinjiang Autonomous Region that kind of transcends bucket 2 and bucket 3. And I'm happy to talk more about any of these efforts, but I figure before I get accused of filibustering like a senator, I will stop there.
Well, thank you so much. I think we'd love to drill down on all of those things, but let's drill down a little bit on what China has done in the development arena with the Belt and Road Initiative, specifically in Africa and Latin America. Really, almost, I wouldn't say behind our backs, but we weren't paying close attention. And it's clearly a challenge, and we need to do something with our own diplomacy, with our own development. Can you talk about what your perspective is on that?
Well, a couple of observations. One, there are certain areas where, like, we're not even competing, because competing implies that it's sort of two sides that show up and are engaged in some sort of like match, right? But we haven't even shown up in some areas. A variety of islands in the Indo-Pacific. The fact that we don't have an agreement already done and negotiated with the compact states, I think, is a huge own goal. The complete absence of sort of a proactive, positive trade agenda in the region. There's all sorts of niche multilateral fora that we just, for whatever reason, tend to neglect. The World Intellectual Property Organization got a lot of attention a few years ago due to some Chinese activity. So I guess the first and most obvious point, particularly obvious to this audience to make, is that if you want to win the competition, you actually have to show up. And in a lot of these areas, for a very modest investment of U.S. resources, we can have an outsized impact. And I also think it's an opportunity for Congress to do sort of its own diplomacy in a way that's effective. I mean, members of Congress tend to go on CODELs to kind of all the sexy places, Israel, Taiwan, places like that. But, going to a lot of the Pacific Islands, going to places that don't get a lot of attention, I think can have an outsized impact. The second point I would make is that, as a great Wisconsinite, George Kennan, once said, you have no idea how much it contributes to the general politeness and pleasantness of diplomacy to have a nice, quiet little armed force in the background. And so I think we need to do a better job of ensuring that our diplomatic efforts are connected to a robust military deterrent. The administration is trying to make this concept of integrated deterrence work. I've been somewhat critical of it, but I take the point that you can't think of this. You can't have the three lines of effort that I laid out at the beginning completely unconnected. And one of the things we're trying to do on the committee is actually have a hearing similar to what they just did in the Senate Appropriations Committee, where we have representatives from state, treasury, commerce, and DOD, which really testify together to really push the administration productively on whether or not our development efforts or diplomatic efforts are connected to our military efforts. One note of caution, however, as we consider this question of working with our allies, of opening lines of communication. I do think that the Biden administration right now is trying to resurrect economic engagement and diplomatic détente with the Chinese Communist Party as a core pillar of our grand strategy. I'm skeptical that this will work for the same reason that it didn't work for the last 2 decades. I just don't think the CCP is interested in cooperation or engagement. They want to expand their power and ideology at our expense. So I think we have to be clear-eyed about that. But there, again, I think we have an opportunity to engage with allies and partners in terms of a global counter Belt and Road initiative, which leads back to my first point. It means you got to show up. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So I don't know if any of that makes sense.
No, yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I actually would love to just drill down a little bit more and ask you to draw on some of your personal experience working in other parts of the world in the military. Where have you seen development actually be a real force enabler or force multiplier for the overall strategy of the United States? And how could we apply that in the China context?
Well, I really saw it in Western Iraq, which was my most formative experience. I did 2 sort of back-to-back deployments there in 2007 and in 2008, and I saw the whole thing transform before my eyes. I mean, going from, I think on the second day of my first deployment, we had a cross-border raid from Al Qaeda in Iraq that killed 50 people in the local village. To by the end of my second deployment, we could walk around the streets without our helmets on, without our body armor, and it was incredibly non-kinetic and safe. And we were doing a lot of work that could be considered more development work than pure counterterrorism or counterinsurgency work. Or we, in some ways, transitioned from the main effort to a supporting effort for those development efforts. And so, for example, I ran an interrogation team on one of my deployments, and we went from sort of interrogating high value terrorists to sort of interrogating, oil smugglers and people that were screwing up the local economy. So it showed to me at the time as kind of a naive 22, 23-year-old second lieutenant, just how interlinked these things are and how you can't sort of separate one from the other. And how it was our ability to show ourselves as the strong horse to provide basic security then opened up the opportunity for economic development and ultimately political reconciliation. We can argue about whether that actually happened in a lasting way, but I guess my only point is that was a very formative experience for me. As a member of Congress and as a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as a staffer, I was fortunate enough to travel, particularly throughout the Middle East, to see kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly of development and diplomacy. Some areas where it worked, some areas where it didn't work, some areas where just sort of, we were dealing with the unintended consequences of neglecting basic economic deprivation for years, i.e. the incidents that kicked off the Arab Spring turned Arab Winter, and how that forced us to rethink some of our longstanding development programs. But I always go back to, I'm like an amateur Cold War historian, or maybe a better way to describe that is a failed academic who wrote a bad political science dissertation that's like decent history and bad political science. This used to be called mutual security in the Eisenhower administration. And I've always liked that idea that it's not charity, it's not just development for development's sake. It sort of expresses this connection between both us and our allies and development and security. And that's, I don't know, but that explains kind of how I think about the overall issue in my own experiences.
You are preaching to this choir. I mean, that is exactly, obviously, how USGLC sees it. Can you actually elaborate maybe a little bit on that? Why is your committee and your mission important to the American people? Because you mentioned the American people,
Yeah.
and this is part of a comprehensive approach.
Well, not to be too much of a downer, but I think just look to Ukraine right now, where notwithstanding the obvious bravery and ingenuity that we're seeing from the Ukrainian people and how inspiring that has been for the West and what a wake-up call that's been. I mean, we're still seeing a war play out that even in the best case scenario going forward is going to be incredibly destructive in terms of blood and treasure. And I think if Ukraine reminds us of anything, it's that we should dedicate ourselves to the task deterrence, to the task of preventing war. Deterrence may be hard, but war is hell. It's much harder. And for whatever reason, we tend to kind of periodically convince ourselves that we've kind of escaped this pernicious like cycle of history whereby nation states can find themselves fighting each other on a battlefield. And I wish that were true, and I wish all of our disputes could be settled in non-kinetic means. But there's a lot of bad guys out there who don't play by the same rules we do. And so I think we need to have a clear-eyed view of that. And that should add urgency to the effort to work together to prevent war in terms of our development efforts, in terms of our diplomatic efforts, in terms of our military deterrence effort. And so translating that to the China Committee, one of my goals is to ensure that Ukraine's present doesn't become Taiwan's future. And when we talk about the defense of Taiwan or Taiwan's defense of itself, it's not just a matter of delivering foreign military sales items that they purchased but we haven't delivered. It's not just a matter of having a bunch of anti-ship missiles there. It's a matter of expanding our cyber partnership with Taiwan, drawing on some of the lessons we've learned in Ukraine about that partnership and this defend forward concept in the military. It's a matter of thinking through the economic and financial aspects of a potential confrontation with China so that we can develop a theory of economic and financial deterrence in the same way that we have a theory of conventional and strategic deterrence. Because even in a low-end scenario for a confrontation with China, i.e. a blockade, you're talking about trillions of dollars lost and an absolute disruption to the global economy that's going to punish a lot of very poor people around the world. So I guess that's a long way of me saying I think part of our task on the committee is to learn the lessons from recent foreign policy crises and apply them in the Indo-Pacific so that we can preserve peace and stability. And I'll land on the point that I think, therefore, the American people should care about Taiwan, about the threat posed by the CCP, because it's not a distant over there problem. It's not a matter of some obscure territorial claim in the South or East China Sea. It's a matter of protecting our own economy and our own way of life and our own sovereignty from authoritarian and totalitarian aggression. And occasionally we have things like a spy balloon incident to remind us that it's not an over there problem, but then we lapse back into complacency. And so that's my pitch for why you should care about the work we're doing on the committee.
Yeah, no, you're spot on. I mean, obviously,
Oh, did I lose you?
obviously, we are the preeminent military, economic, political, diplomatic power in the world. And even if we want to ignore the bad guys, they're not going to ignore us. They're going to come after us. So thank you for that, Congressman. And I also thank you for making the linkage between what's happening in Ukraine and Taiwan. At the McCain Institute hosted our annual Sedona Forum. And at that forum, Taiwan's representative to the United States said, Ukraine's security is Taiwan's security. Ukraine's victory is Taiwan's victory. So clearly these autocrats are looking at one another, they're cooperating, coordinating, and we need to hold strong, exactly as you said, to preserve our economy and our way of life.
Could I make a point on McCain? Sorry to upend
absolutely. No, you.
Well, before he passed away, I would say one of the most powerful experiences I've ever been a part of. I was doing well, first of all, he invited me when I was a member-elect. I wasn't even sworn in to the Halifax Forum. And he was so gracious to me and treated me like a member of Congress. It was a really cool experience. And then just made jokes about the Marine Corps for the entire
of course.
weekend. And then I was on a CODEL with Mac Thornberry where we were in Vietnam, and McCain happened to be there at the same time. And he gave us a tour of the Hanoi Hilton. And then obviously that was incredibly powerful. But to see the way in which he was basically treated like a rock star in Vietnam, and to step back and think about all the history we obviously have with Vietnam, and now they have such a positive view of America, and obviously they're a critical node in this alliance and partnership structure to counter China. I don't know. It was both a testament to McCain's unique leadership, but just the enduring power of American values, I think.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. The McCain name means a lot. I know that Cindy McCain also spoke to this audience earlier today. She's also serving our country as we speak. Maybe the best way to end this, and I think that the time is up, is to ask you, just because you brought up Senator McCain, to just reflect quickly on the bipartisan element of your work, because you've received, rightly so, a lot of praise for your close partnership with your colleague, Representative Krishnamurti. If you could just talk a little bit about your approach there.
Well, I would confess I was really skeptical of working with Raja, not because he's a Democrat, but because he's from Chicago. And I have an ingrained distrust of Bears fans that's hard to overcome. But we've actually been good partners prior to this committee. We founded the Middle Class Jobs Caucus together, and he's been a phenomenal partner. And I think really has a very clear-eyed understanding of the ideological, economic, and military threat posed by the CCP. He's also just really, really smart. And so I really got lucky in terms of the partner I have on the committee. I would say both Speaker McCarthy and Leader Jeffries set the tone from the start. We had a meeting with all our committee members where both the Speaker and the Minority Leader were there, and this never happens. I've never seen it before. And they basically said, if you want to throw bombs on TV, we have committees for that. This is not that committee, and so kindly see yourself out the door. And they did a great job of selecting serious members on both sides. And so it's made it easier to preserve the bipartisanship. Obviously, there are fault lines, not just between the parties, but within the parties. Some of the biggest divides we have on this issue are actually not necessarily between Republicans and Democrats, but between, let's say, the national security community and the financial services community. So that creates a unique challenge at time. But I think we always have to remember, at least what I think, is that China's strategy, or the Chinese Communist Party strategy, is to divide us. It is what Wang Huning wrote when he published a book in 1991 called America Against America. That's not only sort of his particular thesis, it's the strategy that he and Xi have pursued in the years since, to pit Americans who they believe are greedy and factional against each other to prevent America from defending itself. So keeping that in mind is essential to preserving the bipartisanship, maintaining member relationships. The sort of platonic ideal in my mind is the relationship that I had with Angus King on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. We not only became partners on that commission where we trusted each other, we became genuine friends. And the more you have those personal relationships, the easier it is to get stuff done. And so that's sort of the ethos I've tried to take to the committee. Hopefully we'll be able to preserve that even as we get closer to the 2024 presidential election, which has a way of enhancing partisanship in Congress. But so far, it's been a great partnership. And again, I can't say enough good things about Raja for his leadership.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Congressman. We are lucky to have had you here. Thank you.
Thank you. It's hard for me to hear the thunderous applause, but I'm just imagining them.
We'll make it louder. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.